Well, I think we can go ahead now. So good morning, everyone from Brussels, and welcome to our event on Sustainable Product Policy Initiative, a new framework for environmental performance of products. My name is Vasilios Rizos. I'm head of Sustainable Resources and Circular Economy at SEPS, and I will be the moderator of this discussion. Now, last week, the European Commission adopted the highly anticipated Sustainable Products Initiative, a package of interlinked initiatives on sustainable products. And as you have probably seen, a key objective of this initiative is to consolidate sustainability requirements for products under a harmonizing framework, which would include rules on information disclosure, digital product passport, eco-design rules for non-energy related products, and mandatory green public procurement criteria. Now, this, of course, represents a renewed policy approach, and in many ways, it is an ambitious proposal. At the same time, of course, there are many open questions on implementation, timeline, and key challenges ahead. Now, to discuss about this initiative and address these questions, we are very pleased to have with us Matjaž Malgaj, who is head of the Unit of Sustainable Products at the DG Environment of the European Commission. Matjaž will first of all guide us into the details of the initiative, and then we also have the opportunity to answer questions. Now, just a couple of remarks before we go ahead. First of all, the event is currently also live streamed to the YouTube channel, and it will be made available there later in case you would like to go back and check any of the points raised today. Secondly, the presentation by Matjaž will be sent to all of you after the event at some point, so there's no need to ask for this later. And finally, and most importantly, there is a Q&A function in the Zoom, which maybe you're already familiar with, and you can use it throughout the event to send questions. And we'll try to take as many as possible and bring them in the discussion later. Now with no further delay, I would like to give the floor to Matjaž Malgaj. First of all, Matjaž, pleasure to have you with us today. Thank you for taking the time. I know you have been busy working for quite some time on this package, and a lot of us have also been waiting for this proposal since a long time. So we are still trying to digest its various elements. So maybe you can help us a little bit in this regard. So what are the key elements that make this initiative more ambitious, let's say, and what we should pay attention to, and what are the really key steps and things that we should be waiting for in the coming months, but also in the coming years, I guess. So I guess we will share your slides now. Yeah.
Good morning, Vasilios. Thanks a lot for having me. Yes, it's true. We've been working for quite a while on this, I would say, rather rewarding proposal. Rewarding in a sense, because there was so much expectation out there for a reason. So in that sense, it was a pleasure. Just a short clarification. I'm also coordinator actually of what we call Sustainable Products Initiative, which is co-led by 3 Directorate Generals. So Environment, Grow and Energy. I just always like to point this out. It's very important because it's also been a pretty innovative way of working in a co-creation mode inside the Commission. I have prepared a short presentation to maybe help structure the discussion. I think Javier is going to help us guide us through, and then this should take something around 10 to 12 minutes, and then I'm really open to all the questions. And also for us, it's very important to understand what the questions are out there, and I can commit if there are some that I cannot answer at this stage. This is certainly going to help us in preparing for the future discussions. So if we can move on to slide 1, please. Just a short reminder, because this really is one of the main objectives of the proposal. Basically, environmental problems that come from inefficient use of resources are huge, and the trends, despite all the efforts of the past decades, are not very good. What we like to quote is the International Resource Panel's tripling of the global extraction of materials. What we also talk about is triple crisis, if you wish. We have climate, biodiversity, and pollution crisis, and a lot of biodiversity, I mean, massive share of biodiversity loss and water stress comes from the resource extraction, and not only related to food production. Last point, which has been prominent already for a while during the pandemics before, but is now even more evident in the context of the Russian aggressive war on Ukraine, it's that the EU is one of the continents that's very highly depending on materials that come from the outside. So our objectives are environmental, but working on environmental objectives actually can also help us on reducing this dependency. Consequence of what I mentioned is that planetary boundaries are breached in at least 3 areas, and I think what we use, the research work we used would now probably require adding chemicals to that, but at the moment I'm quoting what we've got. So for those of you who would take more time to study this, I think we really made an effort to analyze the problems in the impact assessment that are linked to the production and products themselves. And the last point where we hope to make a difference with this proposal is that despite quite some successes in terms of policy and also private sector mobilization towards a more circular economy, we are still missing a lot of opportunities there. So it's clearly that despite all the efforts, I would say, of the past 10 plus years in terms of European policymaking, we are still quite behind the rates of circularity, the uptake of new business models, and so on. So that was also one of this. This is one of the things we hope to affect in a positive way. If we can move on to the next slide, please. Now, the main point, there was really a lot of questions that we had on this during the consultation. The main point that we were given as a mandate was to really build on the eco-design framework. And that is because there's a wide recognition that it delivered a lot. We're aware that there's also quite some disappointment about the potential that could be probably even bigger, but basically the approach that the directive takes was seen as the one that we should try to emulate. So our new proposal for regulation remains within this framework legislation approach that basically depends on multi-annual working plans where we set priorities, and then product-specific measures being assessed independently, each one, and then rolled out as an implementing measure. We foresee delegated acts for legal reasons in our proposal. If we can move on to the next slide, please. Now, of course, if we just stay within the good of the eco-design directive, we needn't do all this work. And here I just want to bring out some of the most important novelties. I mean, clearly, the one that everybody was looking for was what is the scope? And we opted for a near universal scope. There are a few exceptions. But here I really want to emphasize, when we say this does not mean that the Commission will be regulating every product that exists, because it simply doesn't make sense. We'll be working on prioritization, we'll be working on where the impacts, environmental impacts are biggest, where there is improvement potential. And this universal scope basically gives us the freedom and flexibility and future-proofness, if you want. But of course, the measures themselves will be really focusing on priority areas. Another novelty that we felt was essential if this approach is to work is that we foresee for a systematic use of horizontal measures. So basically measures where specifics of different product groups allow us to regulate across them. And with this, basically save also time and resources for everybody involved. We had foreseen also another really, I think, big novelty is introduction of the digital product passport. Again, not something we invented. Those already exist in various supply chains, either as a voluntary initiatives or as a company-driven initiatives, but it was felt and also it was agreed by majority of people who were taking part in consultation that this would be very important addition to have. I'm going to say a few words on it later on. Another issue that was already part of the original political mandate is that we should introduce measures to prevent destruction of unsold consumer goods. This is a rather counterintuitive problem when you look at it, but then when you look at some of the evidence we could gather, and we looked at, for example, that member states such as France identified, it's actually quite sizable. So that was another point that was introduced, and maybe two more comments to make. One, that this regulation foresees that we could have mandatory green public procurement requirements. So in areas where we set minimum performance requirements, we could also decide to bind national authorities to actually use the better performing classes when they do their public procurement. So trying to create an additional pull effect. And lastly, a big part of what we've done was also looking at the functioning of internal market, of the problems that we could see will arise if we don't regulate at European level. And part of this was also that clear recognition that more needs to be done to improve market surveillance. So it sounds a bit self-evident, but I think there are already Commission identified significant missed energy efficiency benefits in the current eco-design because of suboptimal market surveillance. So that's another area that we wanted to improve. Can please move on to the next slide. This basically is let's call it a legal nutshell of the proposal. The requirements that we would be setting would be either performance requirements, so minimum requirements that the product has to meet in order to be allowed to the market, or information requirements. So basically, the option of using one or the other or both together is open, and we would be guided by our impact assessment, by our analysis, in seeing which measures would be most effective. The idea is not to build up trophies of different requirements to overregulate, but really to look at the effectiveness of different measures and then choose those that are useful. As you see on the right-hand side of the slide, basically the aspects that we look of the products that should be improved or that should be conveyed as information have a lot to do with promoting circularity, but also basically including all the major environmental impacts, including carbon and environmental footprint. So we hope that with this ability to choose the right type of requirement and looking at the broad array of product aspects, we can get the optimal mix for each of the products that will be regulated. If we can move on to the next one, please. Just a couple of other things to mention outside this core. I already mentioned the destruction of goods and mandatory green public procurement. And I should probably add customs control to market surveillance, because clearly important part of this proposal, which is already the case with eco-design, is it applies to all the products that are placed on the European market. So whether they come as imports or whether they're launched from within. So in that sense, customs control plays a mirror role to what market surveillance should do inside the market. If we move on, please, to the next one. Now, just a couple of slides to mention a little bit, to focus a little bit on the digital product passport. Very important point that we took very seriously in the public consultation was, please be careful not to design a very elaborate, very detailed, very worked out system that is sort of not related to the product in question that you want to deal with. So the whole approach is really based on a decentralized system. We will be going as we go, if you want. We want to develop, let's call it the basic layer of requirements, but then adjust this to each of the product groups or horizontal measures. We took note of all the points that were made on business information, ask only what you need. So the basic principle in the digital product passport is that in principle, all parts of the supply chain are covered, and then each of the actors adds the information that is necessary for the next one, and it would be accessible on a need-to-know basis. So probably the public authorities would be the only ones who get the full overview if they need that for enforcement needs. But otherwise, it's really not overloading with information, but making sure that the information is available to to different players in the supply chain, and also consumer when that is relevant. If we move on to the next one, there was a number of benefits that were identified. So there's a slide with all these examples. I wouldn't read through them, but we clearly see that a lot of manufacturers are already capable of doing, or actually doing, what we're asking to do. And especially that players further down the supply chain should generally really benefit from this traceability of information. So setting up a system at the beginning is probably an upfront investment, but then at the end it ensures a much higher scrutinability of your supply chains. There would be also positive impacts on the public authorities. And at the end, with the whole digitalization, we do foresee that probably consumer information would be increasingly relevant, but it was not the only driver. I really think it's important to point to this business-to-business component. If we move on to the next slide, please. Now, what do we want to achieve on a very high level? We didn't set any targets, which was on purpose, because it didn't seem to make sense to set specific target on a toolbox. But clearly, if you even look at the monitoring indicators that we put in, we do want to continue with the success that the current Eco Design Directive is achieving on energy efficiency. But clearly, and probably this is the main reason why we're moving beyond it, we want to contribute to reducing environmental impacts on a number of other environmental areas where products play a big role. And here, just to give you an illustration, the products that are within the scope are currently responsible for around 65% of all product-related greenhouse gas emissions and particulate matter emissions. I mean, two different categories, almost the same coverage. And also for around 70% of resource depletion. So if we link this to the planetary boundaries I mentioned before, we have a tool that potentially can fill a lot of gaps. There should be strong benefits for the consumers. Clearly also part of something we had in mind. Public consultation identified very clearly that people do genuinely want longer functionality of products. They want repairs to be easier, more accessible. There is a need for more information, and energy savings again remain one of the massive benefits. I think with the current energy prices, I want to give a figure I don't want to be quoted in press on, but I think we're looking at well over 200 billion of savings for consumers based on the savings on a current Eco Design Directive. So this can be projected to be much higher in the future. The next slide, please. So I mentioned consumers, I mentioned the environmental goals. What we do foresee for also for the industrial players, for the businesses to have reduced material costs, that those businesses, so no matter whether they come from outside or from within the EU, but those businesses that do invest in having sustainable products should also see their increased competitiveness, and that there would be increased transparency across supply chain. So again, for businesses that want to be sustainable, life should become easier with once we start rolling out the measures here. And on a macro level, clearly we see an additional push to decoupling of economic activity from resource use, increase use of materials, keeping them within the value chains, and I mean increased circular use of materials, and also reduce raw material dependencies. So all these together leads to increased resilience. I think it leads me to my last slide. Now, what we think needs to happen for all this to work. First, there is a focus that Commission is putting already on rolling out measures in the next few years. So not waiting until the regulation to enter into force, but working on priority products in framework of current eco-design directive. There, you should also expect, where relevant, increased focus on circularity to the extent that we can on current legal basis. We are absolutely aware that the member states will be reluctant at the beginning to look at the delegated acts as a way of regulating. We don't see any other option, both from legal and from efficiency point of view, but we hope to win the trust through a very transparent process. So we want to build on what's already there through a stakeholder forum, really making sure that preparing the programs is a co-creation that then allows them to get us with a more efficient rulemaking through delegated acts. Here I want to mention, so multi-annual work programs. We are already working together with our colleagues in the Joint Research Center on what we could call a proto working plan, something that I hope we would have ready by the end of this year, and would basically use it as a public consultation in parallel to negotiations on the proposal itself, so that the Commission is really ready to start from the blocks on the day that the regulation enters into force. Methodological approaches, we're working with colleagues in the JRC. We have a lot of experience in energy-related products. We had done a lot of progress in product environmental footprint rules. We'll be looking at basically working on top of the shelf methodologies to be used here, verifiable, not assailable, but we do recognize there's quite a lot of, it's a big challenge to move just from regulating energy efficiency or energy use stage to doing all the things I mentioned there. So probably we will need to progress in let's call it waves of measures to be sure that we are constantly on a very solid ground. And then the last point, we will need strengthened enforcement. I mentioned a couple of times that before. Member states will have to do more, because there's little point in having the best rules and the best regulated market in the world if those rules are not enforced. I think this leads me to a thank you, but yes, thank you. So Vasilios, I'm all yours. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot, Matjaž. That was very useful. And yeah, it already raises quite a few questions in the chat box. I'm not surprised. Of course, the ambition is very high, as I mentioned in my introduction, and you know, it is certainly a very highly anticipated initiative. You know, a lot of people working in this field, Matjaž, were hoping for more harmonized, more integrated initiative. And let's say that in many ways this initiative fulfills this aspiration. But to kick off the right of questions, maybe we quickly ask if you can, your views on implementation. This is something that has been raised already by some people. You know, of course, it's a very ambitious package, but at the same time, you know, the process will take some time. Having delegated acts, impact assessments for different product groups, that's something that will take quite some time. We're speaking even for the next, of course, Commission circle for some products at least. So I was wondering, you know, is there here any risk that the ambition is high, but the process will be very long? I mean, I was wondering, what are your thoughts on this? And how do you think this risk could be mitigated, maybe? Yeah,
thanks a lot. No, a perfectly valid question. First point is, when I came, it's actually just around a year ago when I was asked to coordinate this. Clearly, the first question was, should we really stick to the current process? Can't we come up with something that is more, you know, that's lean and short? And then, but the problem is that if you want to regulate through a, let's call it the directive type, we were thinking about setting out principles, sustainability principles, but that then creates uncertainties in their own. Because how are you going to regulate a product if in country A, they decide that sustainability is 20%, you know, more demanding than in country B. So in a way, we were a bit of prisoners of this approach, but clearly what we looked at how to mitigate this is A, have enough people on all sides of the equation, so member states, Commission, try to, and this is something we will still continue developing in the next 2 years, try to shorten the time by trying to run some things in parallel. And here especially we have to look at the better regulation rules. How do we structure public consultations so it's not going in long sequences, but that it maybe runs in parallel to some of the processes. Some of the work will be pure managerial nitty-gritty, looking at how to optimize preparation of 40 impact assessments as opposed to working on 5. Clearly learning doing. So the rolling out innovative rules, and then first verifying how they work, and then rolling out the next generation. So no magic wand there. But we do think that with enough people and with shortening some of the time that is needed to get from the entry into the working program to entry into force. And then finally, by having horizontal rules, where we hope that with developing one cross-cutting measure, for example, on repairability of all electronic devices, it's not been decided, I'm just listing a probable case, you could reap quite a lot of benefits through one single legal act if you want. So although it may take you 2 years, you are basically then covering quite substantial problem being solved, both for consumers and for environmental impacts. Any other brilliant ideas that are out there and we missed, super welcome.
We'll make you aware of what, if we have any, of course. Matjaž, there are already quite 20 questions in the chat box. I'll try to pick some of them, maybe bring them to you like in in packages, and you take forward what you think you can address now. As you said in your introduction, it's not you can cover everything at this stage. So first of all, we have a question from Thierry Bernier from CO2 Value Europe, who asks basically whether there will be requirements for renewable carbon feedstock or for products, or any, I guess, requirements on CO2 requirements for products. That's interesting. And then there is also a question by Katrien de Gogh, who's asking whether there will be a need to fulfill both performance and information requirements, and whether this is, whether it's interpreted this correctly. And I noticed there was another question further down the chat box asking whether some of these information requirements will at some point turn into obligatory requirements. So maybe that's something that the companies should start getting prepared for. A few questions I've picked up to kick off, let's say. Yeah.
Thank you. First thing is, we do take seriously the process of working programs. So what I'm giving now is I'm giving examples of things that could happen, but we will want to really have a solid proposal with what we do first. But on all things to do with CO2 first, we do foresee that all impacts that you find in the environmental footprint, which includes carbon footprint, could be subject to measures. So there you can do two things. You can either put an information requirement so that everybody understands what's the CO2 footprint, or hypothetically, you could also put a performance requirement. A certain product that doesn't meet a threshold of X% or X value cannot be sold. I don't want to create an impression that all is cooked up, because it's not. This will really have to look at very carefully. Also to note that our colleagues dealing with climate policy had launched a request for a European or international standard on things to do with climate neutrality. So we'll be carefully looking at issues like renewable stock, but you do have to be very careful there, because one thing we really cannot have is to adopt rules that then export or hide problems and put them somewhere else. So here, at least personally, I would want to be very strict that the standards we use or the methods we develop are really robust, and that they contribute to the problems we're trying to solve, not just to create rules for their own sake. Yes, performance and information requirements could exist at the same time. You could, for example, have a performance requirement, which is repairability. So you know that we do have repairability scoring developed by the Joint Research Center. So for example, you could set a requirement that a certain product has to be durable, so that a breakdown cycle doesn't appear before 5 years, that it has to be repairable at category A, and at the same time still have an information requirement on its carbon footprint, just an example. What we'll do is our impact assessment on each measure will basically look at what are the most effective measures. I mean, we do know sometimes information can be effective, sometimes not. So in this sense, it's really going to be looking at what could you do with the label, because we can also have labels. It's not just the DPP, but what we foresee is still using energy labels for energy-related products, and then we could have other labels, sustainability labels, if that was seen effective. I'm not sure I completely got the last question. So if you want to pin me down again on it, or we just move on to the next one.
I think you already alluded to this, so no worries. Matjaž, we have now another comment from Jan Tijtkat from Umicore, who is, first of all, he's very supportive of the initiative. And he has a question related to coherence between different requirements coming from different pieces of legislation. So he asked how you're going to guarantee that the use of renewable energy under RED and the product environmental footprint requirements will be used in a uniform way. And some of these requirements are to be amended by the battery regulation proposal. So, whether you have any thoughts on ensuring coherence there. And maybe if I can extend a little bit this question on the product environmental footprint requirements. I know there was work in the previous cycle of the circular economy package on some pilots. Is this the instrument that you think will be core for the new eco-design kind of framework? Do you see, and if this is the case, do you see like more such methodologies developed for more groups in the future, also non-energy related products? Any thoughts on this in these domains, let's say?
Thanks a lot. The question on coherence is a very important one. So the basic approach we take with this regulation is the following. We know that there are other product related requirements out there. So we looked at this, and it was impossible to do an omnibus that would be changing everything and have one big monster regulation. What we take, the approach we take is the center of gravity. So basically, for areas where environmental sustainability is already regulated at the sufficient level of detail, if you want it. For example, the batteries proposal, I do not see us in foreseeable future or ever needing to have a complementary regulation to batteries, because basically that is already a product focused sustainability, environmental sustainability approach. For the others, we will either look very closely in a need to regulate at all. So I could also foresee packaging. We have an option to do it, but it's rather a safety net exception rather than a rule. And then in other areas where the one that, for example, was mentioned, we will very carefully look in our impact assessment on what aspects are already regulated in a related measure, so that we make sure we don't have a double regulation there. So that's, I think, what I can offer now. On the footprint, I think what's important to keep in mind here is that a lot of product aspects that I mentioned have nothing to do with the footprint as such. I mean, if you want to make something more durable, you need a standard for this. But the reason you're doing it is twofold. One is to reduce the environmental impact of things breaking down too fast, and this will then show on your environmental assessment that you may be doing through for example, PF. So I think what will be our basic guidance will be, since the Commission had issued a recommendation where you can use a PEF to understand the environmental impacts, you absolutely do that, and then you decide based on this assessment what measures, what aspects will you need to regulate. So that you could either do by setting requirements that have limits corresponding to those 16 categories, or you just have something different. Because, for example, a number of circularity issues, you just need a standard or a methodology that has nothing to do with the footprint. So it's going to really be a choice of problem identified and most effective solution. Will then pick what we need to.
Okay. I'm also trying to take notes because it's also interesting for me as well. Matjaž, there are some questions by Jan Besembinders, hope I pronounced the names correctly, on the labor costs of remanufacturing and refurbishing, which are high in some parts of Europe, and whether such requirements could introduce barriers for businesses. I don't know, maybe you have some reflections on this in general, maybe something you have heard as one of the barriers. And then there's a question regarding the requirements on packaging. There is, of course, an ongoing process on the packaging waste legislation. So the question here is that if any measures on packages will be dedicated there, or some of it can also be included in future delegated acts targeting like some product groups under the eco-design framework. I mean, whether you see this work separate or integrated somehow. Yeah.
Thanks. On remanufacturing and basically refurbishing, so I'd say on a high adding value activities, what we certainly hope to help is by removing some of the bottlenecks that were already clearly identified. For example, we have provisions to allow us, if we look in a sector where there's a high remanufacturing potential, we could be adopting the rules in that sector, could be setting out, let's say, a higher degree of disassemblability, that's a word. We could be looking at making sure that the chemical substances are either not present or they're very clearly identified. So what hopefully we could do is bring the cost down a little bit or substantially on some of the, let's call it more higher added value circular economy activities. So really to move to help recycling, but also to move much more in the up the chain. Whether this we don't have measures that would directly impact the labor costs. What I do see though is also potential for the green public procurement. So it's more on a pull side. Because there you could, if there were areas where this would make sense, you could create a bigger market that usually brings costs down with the efficiencies of scale. On the packaging, as I said before, we have left the possibility to regulate packaging when it's really central to the product in the ESPR, but otherwise packaging will continue to be regulated under the revised packaging directive proposal that I think is due not so far from now.
Thank you, Matjaž. As you probably expect, there's a few questions on digital product passport. So yeah, there is a comment here from Egil from IKEA, if I understand correctly. She congratulates first of all the Commission on the package, and she asks, how this passport is expected to be used by consumers. I don't know if you have already some views on this. And then there's some other question from Anders Bomholt from the Danish Business Authority, who's asking what is the reasoning behind having a digital product passport where data is kept decentralized by companies, and then at the same time a central registry in the Commission with all data from product passport. And he asks whether he has a question of whether this could lead to unnecessary administrative burden for companies, basically. Yeah.
Thank you. I'll start at the end. Yeah, if we had a database that would replicate everything that companies have to store, that would be unnecessary burden for us and for the companies. What we foresee is a thin central registry, basically allowing us to have let's get a feedback relay to the information. So this can be used for the enforcement purposes. So the central registry is meant to be a thin registry allowing sort of traceability of things that are stored in a decentralized way. As you can clearly also see, I have to confess, I'm not a digital expert. So I know enough about it, but how exactly will the central registry work? This is something we still have to discuss, but the objective is to have a thin sort of enforcement related registry. On a question from IKEA, thanks a lot for your congratulations, and I'll have a word with you about my children's bed and its disassemblability. Look, DPP in principle will be linked, the information will be stored in a unique identifier. Let's assume this is a barcode. It's not the only one that you could have. when designing rules for a product or categories of products, horizontal rules, you would decide which information is available to whom. So there may be information that's irrelevant for the consumer, but is relevant for the supply chain operator. So the consumer would basically see, let's say this is a product that has a label, and there's a number of information requirements that we set in addition. So the consumer, when scanning the unique identifier, would get consumer relevant information on his iPhone, tablet, whatever they use. Thank you.
Thank you, Matjaž. If you allow me to stay for a few more seconds on the battery passport, I have a question myself. On the product passport, sorry, there is ongoing legislative work as part of the battery regulation, of course, and then there is a passport in the works or being discussed. So, I was wondering, how do you see the work in this other legislative portfolio influencing the work that will be conducted under the eco-design framework? And whether you have any plans to ensure consistency between the work? And secondly, you mentioned in the presentation already the proliferation of different industry-led initiatives. So a lot of companies have already started putting these schemes that resemble a passport in the market, and we've seen many of them in the past couple of years. So I was wondering, you mentioned you will take them into account, but on practical terms, I was wondering if you have any thoughts. How do you think they can be accounted for in the legislative framework? I mean, do you see like a framework enabling some of them under certain criteria continue operating, or getting like formal recognition, or do you have something else in your mind at this preliminary stage? Yeah, these were the two further questions on the passport.
Yeah, thank you. First to mention that we had under our Digital Europe, I think it's called, the program, we actually have, and I think they've probably just been adopted these days. So we have a number of huge pilot scale projects that are basically working out how the thing work with actors from the private sector. So while we are negotiating the proposal, we're already having a real life experiment on how to develop it. The basic principle is really to work, let's call it on a few layers. It's almost like a 3-layer structure. So one very basic information, what should be in the passport, that's already included in a regulation. Then we would sort of set the second set of requirements that would be applying across the board in a delegated act. And then the final one would be included in the delegated act on each of the products. The idea is to work, of course, with the industry to come up with something that can work for everybody. We have to work in public interest. So we'd probably be very, very careful about creating proprietary technology solutions that would prevent small players or later entrants to be inhibited. But basically, we don't come to this with an over prescriptive approach. So we don't pretend we know everything. We know what our objectives are. We know what we want to avoid. And we know solutions are out there. But the basic idea is we work together with the industry now in a very open, transparent manner to ideally develop things in an almost voluntary way and then regulate them. And of course, if at the end, you cannot put everything in one tent, you have to make choices what is in best public interest. But the approach is really to work together, not to block things in their tracks. But the idea is to achieve its scale as well. So just saying it's good that you have something is probably not going to work. And the approach we take is also open. So we focus on environmental sustainability. But I would say whatever we develop, and that's why also we have Connect involved so closely, we would want it to be developed in mind if people see other uses that can maybe use it, so we don't force the industry to develop parallel passports for different purposes. But we starting from little and then we're growing to big. I think this is the approach that was also strongly advocated in the public consultation.
Okay, thank you, Matjaž. There are a few questions on the processes and product groups, as you probably are expected to be included in the scope of this eco-design regulation. For example, there is a question by Marianne Rosbach from Rockwool, whether construction products will fall under the scope of this initiative, or whether this will only be covered by the construction product regulation, I guess. If I can extend this question, you mentioned a number of product groups in your initiative: textiles, furniture, but also intermediate products, aluminium, steel. Of course, you are now starting to put the first milestones of the first working plan, but I was wondering if you have any thoughts on potential candidates and any views on the process and materials to be covered. Yeah.
Thank you. Yet more good questions. First, on the construction products regulation. So we developed both in close cooperation, so CPR and ESPR. And sorry for the acronyms, it's inevitable. So in principle, the intermediate materials that can be used in construction, but can also be used for other things, such as steel, fall within the competence of the sustainable products regulation. The only exception is cement, because cement is the only intermediate product that is used exclusively in construction. But the construction products regulation that was adopted in the same package also have almost a mirror requirements taken into account. It's a bit of a different instrument. So basically, it should develop sustainability measures that would mirror what we would be developing under the sustainable products regulation. In addition, we even agreed on a safety net clause that allows us to intervene in construction products if we see the need to do it. The main choice of why construction products regulation is also dealing with sustainability requirements is that construction is specific in a way, because when you're developing requirements also for safety, it's been seen it's better if this is done within one set of consultation stakeholders and so on. So basically, the both instruments should work in sync with one another. That is the answer on the CPR. On the questions, look, we've mentioned few products or product groups already in the communication. We have preliminary lists that we were developing together, and then we decided not to go out with just a list of things or start mentioning A or B, and rather wait until we really have a robustly explained choice towards the end of this year. So I think people out there pretty much know. I mean, textiles has been mentioned very clearly. There's also a strategy that was adopted. So we'll clearly be looking at them. We'll be looking at intermediate products. I'd say with a little patience, we'll be very happy to lay out our sort of detailed views on what should be the first categories. And this will be subject to sort of structured discussion. So there will be public consultation basically on this with all the stakeholders. And as I said, we expect to be doing this towards the end of this year.
Thank you, Matjaž. No, there are really many good questions, and it's difficult for me to pick, to pick from the list from a long list of questions we have. So maybe I move to a question by Manuel Soca from HP, Hewlett Packard, who has a question on what is the difference between Eco-Design Forum and the current consultation forum under Eco-Design, and what is the interlink with the creation of the member state forum. And also he has a question on international standards, and what is the openness of the European Commission to basically accept international life cycle assessment standards and industry benchmarks, and or whether they should only focus on the product environmental footprint methodology, and that's what should be expected in the future. Yeah.
On the forum, we basically have to. The whole idea was to keep similar degree of openness and collaboration. We simply have to see once the regulation is adopted whether we need to add or take away from what's going on already now. But basically, the principle is similar as we have in Eco-Design Forum now. So that's the first question. The second one, as I said, on any methodology we will use, clearly we favor international cooperation. So if we have international standards, or if we can finish international standards in the making, we'd be very open to look at that. I mean, one important objective that we have is to eventually really work with our partners in developing rules together. As you know, the EU is much more advanced in some areas than many other jurisdictions are. So in some cases, this will not be possible. In terms of industry benchmarks and so on, I mean, we will strive to have verifiable methodologies that are very robust, that can be replicated by anybody. So I would say the starting point is not to just accept anything, because there's little point in regulating something that is already being done, but rather to see, is there a need for industry-wide on this product increase of ambition? Can this be done in a way, you know, we have all the requirements that we have to do when we prepare a measure. We have to look at the affordability, technical ability, and so on. So I cannot give a uniform answer, but clearly where we look at the life cycle assessments, we have to look at what we had developed at the European Union level. So if we have recommendation to use PEF in certain areas, it would be expected we would use it as well. Again, it would be a bit too hypothetical. I'm not a politician. Politicians never answer hypothetical questions. I'm like a civil servant, so I'm giving hypothetical examples just to illustrate what may happen, but I wouldn't want to create an expectation that it's going to be black and white. But if we have a life cycle assessment, we have recommendation at the European Union level what should be used, so we'll probably try to use that. It may turn out that we need something else for different aspects, and then we'll clearly look what's out there, from benchmarks to standards. But the key is in replicability, verifiability, so that everybody really understands what are we doing and what to expect. That's the key.
Matjaž, many thanks. And I take the last round of questions. We have 5 minutes left, and you decide what you can answer at this stage. So first, we have a question by Julia Zila from Applya, the association representing the home appliances in Europe. And Julia asks whether basically has some concerns regarding the current methodology for assessing the requirements under the EU eco-design framework. She makes the point that the current eco-design directive has a very clear methodology on how to set eco-design requirements. And you know, I guess that's something to be developed, Matjaž, but maybe you can say a few words on this. There was a question by Georgia Murgia from Digital Europe on I guess the interference between chemical and product legislation. She asks, will relevant substance of consent be indicated product by product? You know, that's a good one. And yeah, I'm trying to find, yeah, there was maybe I pick up a last question on the destruction of the unsold goods. There is a question referring to, you know, whether the companies basically should already move ahead and take action to anticipate, let's say, something that will be perhaps included in a final, in a delegated act in the future. You know, I don't know if you have any thoughts on this as well. So maybe 3 questions, but yeah, it's up to you really at this stage. Yeah,
you're very generous. I'll try to answer them. They were all the questions we got today were good, so it would be unfair not to try to answer them. Yes, so typically most of the industries that have products regulated with current eco-design, their main priority was not to have something new that they don't know. In that sense, what I can reassure is, for example, that current MERP, for those of you who are more familiar with it, which is being revised to take into account more also circularity aspects, would, according to the legal proposal, there is no reason to expect that it wouldn't be applied to products whose environmental impact is biggest during the energy use stage. So in that sense, we're talking more about evolution than revolution. So I think in this sense, people can be reassured. There's a vast, I think there's around 40 measures that need to be reviewed. So there's going to be a lot of work going on in the next years already on the basis of what has been developed and worked. But of course, what we have to look into in the future is once the environmental impact becomes more important in maybe other sequence of life cycle, that's a bit of a discussion we need to have a look at. But I think for wherever you have environmental impact being biggest during the energy use stage, and it's energy. I think there you can rest reassured that you'll be working in familiar context. In terms of chemical legislation, there's two possible measures that we could be taken. One is where presence of certain chemicals seriously inhibits recycling or remanufacturing. We could be looking at restrictions, because this is basically pursuing a different goal than registering your chemical within a REACH. This is basically promoting circularity. There is also possible information requirement on presence of substances of concern in a product. That's again because it's a product related objective. However, as I said, we have to do impact assessments on what is feasible on all of this. So there would be separate discussion in that frame. And then on the destruction of goods, again, as I say, I confess I didn't think it was a problem when I saw it as a political mandate. It sounded so counterintuitive. But it happens at pretty large scale, often associated with e-commerce activities. Some countries, such as France and Germany, are already taking national measures. What we foresee in regulation is that with immediate effect, so after entering into force, a transparency obligation, so that basically you have to display what are you doing with the goods that come back to you or that you haven't sold. My personal opinion is that this could become a massive reputational problem for companies, and I think it would be well worth for them looking into how to deal with the problem before we even get into the timeline to adopt the measures. But if that's not the case, and if we see that problem is big enough to be dealt with under our objectives, we would issue. We have an empowerment to do a delegated act. But again, as I said, it's one of the areas where hope dies last, because it sounds so counterintuitive, and that we would see voluntary approaches dealing with the problem before we have to regulate.
Perfect, and I think yeah, thank you, Matjaž, and I think we're reaching the end of this webinar. Yeah, I would like to thank first of all everyone, all the participants in Zoom and YouTube that stayed until the end. It seems like there was a lot of interest. We couldn't unfortunately take all of the questions, but hopefully there will be other occasions in the future. And Matjaž, thank you for your time. And I know there were a lot of questions. You know, yeah, I mean, one thing is for sure, there is a large body of work on the way that will keep you and the Commission busy in the coming months and years, but also organizations like CEPS that do work on this topic. So yeah, hopefully we have further opportunities to discuss in the future, and hope you enjoyed it as much as I did, basically.
I did. And thanks to everybody for really good questions. Maybe just to say, we will have this public consultation on the working program. So, and we're also very open in discussing with stakeholders what's in the proposal. Bear with us, it's few people, time is limited, and we have to do a lot of work, but we'd be happy to continue engaging also with CEPS and other big stakeholder groups in trying to bring the proposal closer. Also very good for us to understand where you see issues. You know, there is a public feedback. I think there is a public feedback to any proposal we adopt. So we'll also be analyzing that. So we'll be looking at what the reception is, where the questions are, and then trying to clarify as much as we can. As you know, we at the moment proposal has not been even presented to member states or the parliament. So we really need to engage with them in an institutional discussion. But in terms of clarifying what we meant to do, this we're super available within the time constraints. So thanks again, Vasilios, also to you and your team. It's been a pleasure, and I wish everybody a nice weekend.
Perfect. Thank you all. Have a good rest of the day and a good weekend.